Our topic tonight is the flood myth. Before we get right into the flood myth, I want to have a little bit of a teaser background. A couple years ago, we went and visited the town or the area called Short Creek, which is on the near the Grand Canyon, on the border between Utah and Arizona. There's two towns that are actually two different corporations, but essentially there's no difference between the two. They're called Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. These are some of the pictures of what Short Creek, those two towns together, look like. They're famous because this was the place where it was built and settled by the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the patriarch of one of whose Elder Joe Jessup here has in front of him his 5 wives, his 46 children, and his 239 grandchildren. And so you can see, anyway, how polygamy can result in fast population increase for the patriarch, right? So for the women, it's pretty much the same as monogamy, or even actually it can be less than a monogamous marriage. The FLDS church has been kind of made famous because of the very distinctive dress that they've adopted within the last 20, 30 years, and also because of their president, their prophet, Warren Jeffs, who is in jail for all sorts of crimes and abuses that he has done. So when you go to this place, it's interesting because it's a community of extremes. On the one hand, there's these giant, very fancy compound houses where a rich leader would have lived, and all of his wives and family and so forth, and so very big, kind of crazy spaces. On the other hand, there are all of these buildings that are just completely unfinished. One of the ways that this community has made money is in the building industry, and going to places around Nevada and Arizona where they help build houses and other kinds of construction using all of their, let's say, children and descendants and so forth as fairly cheap or free labor and so on, and they compete well business-wise, let's say. We went to Warren Jeffs' former compound, which we toured, and we saw how all of the phone taps and everything like that was put into his house so that he can monitor what everybody in the community was doing. And we also had a kind of an insider tour where we saw when an earlier stage, the people there are very apocalyptic, and they believe in the end of the world, and so they built into a mine a kind of a place to store food and hide in the case of apocalypse. All right, so we've talked a little bit, sometimes this is a diagram I've made of some of the different denominations that exist within Mormonism, the broader Latter-day Saint tradition movement. And so the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is actually just one of the polygamous offshoots of the Brighamite or Utah LDS or Mormon Church. So why did I bring that up? Well, in that tradition goes back to Joseph Smith, who is the founder, who had some thoughts about the topic of the flood. So early modern Europeans read the Bible literally, and that they believed the flood story in Genesis narrated a historic event, and so they also assumed that at some point in history, all humans and terrestrial animals were wiped out by a flood, and the only ones that survived are the ones that there's the descendants and from the survivors that were on Noah's Ark. And so Joseph Smith Jr., who's from this kind of early modern time period also believed that, and he tried to fit the Americas into that biblical worldview that 19th century Americans shared. Because something didn't add up. So people who were these literal believers, they believe in a universal flood, they were hard-pressed to understand, why are there all of these native animals and peoples in the Americas? How did they all get here, considering they would have all been wiped out as recently as Noah's flood? And so in composing the Book of Mormon in 1830, Joseph Smith actually narrates two popular 19th century ideas. On the one hand, there is a story of refugees from the Tower of Babel. In other words, this is a story in Genesis that takes place after the flood, and the refugees got onto boats in this story in the Book of Mormon, and they bring animals with them in the boats. And that's an explanation then for why all of these animals are in North and South America. The second story in the Book of Mormon explains how native peoples are descended from lost 10 tribes of Israel. And so there's two different theories that take place actually in the Book of Mormon. But the first one, the one that would have taken place earlier, with refugees from the Tower of Babel, explains about the animals. Okay, so in retrospect, I think this explanation has a few holes. So apparently all members of all American species must have gotten on boats from Babel, since none of those are left in the Old World, right? So we don't have any of these kind of American, species that are found in the Americas only. So again, these refugees must have herded all of the ones that had been, the descendants of those animals that had been on Noah's and the Ark. They took some of them, and those are the ones that end up in the Americas. They don't explain that in the book, but that would have had to have been how it'd been. Anyway, there's more holes in it than that. So anyway, between 1830 and 1840, tens of thousands of European Americans and Europeans were attracted to the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon's idea of connecting the Americas to the Bible. And Joseph Smith went on to announce that the second coming of Christ was at hand, and that the New Jerusalem, where Jesus would reign in his millennial kingdom, would be built in the United States on the frontier with the Indians in the frontier town of Independence, Missouri. He later, when he went to Independence, also said that the Garden of Eden had been located in that area, in that same place where the New Jerusalem would be. So Zion, the New Jerusalem, the peaceable kingdom is a vision of a new Eden. And so Joseph Smith now also says that Jackson County, Missouri was the actual site of Eden. In other words, prior to the universal flood, all humans had lived in the Western Hemisphere, and it's only after arriving in the Eastern Hemisphere did they go on Noah's Ark. So Noah and all of his ancestors, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, lived in this kind of area in Missouri. They built the ark there. The flood covers the earth. They're floating around for 40 days and so forth. And when they're done and the flood starts to recede at Mount Ararat in the Middle East, then that's when the human species is transplanted according to this reinterpretation or new idea that Joseph Smith taught. Like Adam and Eve, the early Latter-day Saints were expelled from Eden, Jackson County, Missouri, and Joseph Smith went on to taught that when Adam and Eve left Eden, they moved to a place called Adam-ondi-Amen, which is in Davis County, Missouri, where he and his followers settled a new town. They also settled a town called Far West, which is where it was said that Cain had slew Abel. So anyway, they're living out and thinking a lot about these Genesis stories, which they're taking literally, and they are reimagining in their own lives on the American frontier in kind of an original and creative way. So literal readings of the Genesis flood story still persist. In this sort of amazing and graphic representation, Christian fundamentalists in Kentucky have built a giant, literal ark and created a kind of a tourist site called Ark Encounter. And this thing is, filled with the interior, and its goal is trying to show how using the kind of technology that you'd see on the Flintstones or something like that, how you could fit all two of every kind of animal on the planet and how they could still be fed and how you could still eliminate their waste and so on using, like I say, I don't know, all this kind of crazy stuff. So it's taking literalism to an amazing and impossible and a preposterous extreme. So in addition to, literal conceptions about the flood in Genesis, literal flooding does also continue. This was a couple years ago. There was flooding across North America, and this is a town here in Canada. We actually had worse flooding last year in British Columbia and so on, but I only point out the one from a couple years ago is that ironically the Ark encounter also was flooded, although I think they were able to put enough sandbags around it so that the Ark didn't actually end up having to float away and preserve everything. So the flood proof is not insured against flood damage. All right, so let's look a little bit about the flood story as it exists in the book of Genesis in chapters 6 through 9. So this is a tale of global holocaust that for some reason is frequently retold for children. We've talked about before in 2 previous lectures, which are Who Wrote the Bible, the documentary hypothesis, and Who Wrote Genesis. We've talked about how there is a 2 hypothetical sources that are involved that may explain why this story of Noah and the flood in Genesis 6 through 9 is especially contradictory. So literary scholars believe that the best explanation is that 2 different stories have been spliced together. Everybody thinks that something has happened. The other hypothesis would be something like there's an original source and then someone has gone through and added stuff to that. But in some ways, because these 2 they don't necessarily speak to each other as well as that. Anyway, you could go either way on how to say it. But anyway, I'm just presenting it here as the documentary hypothesis. There's something going on here with 2 voices. Let me look at it a little bit. So I'm calling anyway here in blue what I'm identifying as the J source, the Yahweh source, and I'm identifying the pink here as the priestly source. So here's the story as it begins as its part in Genesis 7, 1-2. And Yahweh said to Noah, "Come, you and all your household, into an ark, for I've seen you as virtuous in front of me this generation. Of all clean animals, take 7 pairs, man and his woman, and all that are unclean, 2, man and his woman." And so you might know from biblical law that there are certain animals that are clean to eat and others that are unclean to eat. So you can't have, so for shellfish and so forth, the different kinds of Levitical rules. And so in this passage, it's very clear that God is saying you need to keep 7 pairs of the clean animals, but only 2 pairs of the unclean animals. As we say, beyond the unclean ones, there's apparently a bunch of animals that didn't get left off the ark entirely, depending on again your kind of literal interpretation. The people in Kentucky with that ark encounter believe that there were dinosaurs. The dinosaurs had been living in the antediluvial times, but somehow I don't know exactly why they went extinct, but essentially none of them were left to get on the flood. Whether they believe in unicorns and dragons, I don't know. Probably not. So, why does Noah need 7 pairs of the clean animals? The answer here, even in the picture, at the end of the story, Noah offers a sacrifice to God, and so he has to kill animals in order to do that. And that's then when the God creates the covenant with the symbol of the rainbow and so forth at the end of the story. So Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and he took some of the clean animals and each of the clean birds, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the pleasant smell, and Yahweh said to his heart, "I won't curse the ground on account of humankind again." So if there were actually 14 of many of the animals, why are they ever only shown 2 by 2? And the answer is because there's another entirely different account within the Genesis story that contradicts the one I just read. So from the P source, the pink story here, it says, "Of all living," God says, "of all living, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of each to the ark to be kept alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of animals that were pure and of animals that were not pure, and of the birds that creep and everyone that creeps on the ground, they came by 2s to Noah to the ark as God had commanded Noah." So this story, or this version here, makes it very clear that both the clean and the unclean are only, there's only 2 of each one. There's no 7 pairs in this telling. So we have these back between the 2 here. Those are just these side by side. Clean animals take 7 pairs, man and woman. Of the animals that were pure and of impure, they came by 2s. So this is a contradiction existing within the Bible as we have it. Again, another evidence that there's 2 different competing voices in the story that have been spliced together. One of the things we can also point out here is that in the blue story, God is referred to by name. I've been saying Yahweh. This is the name of God that is not to be said, and so it's written out with the 4 letters. In English, it's sometimes been called Jehovah, is how it's been said. But anyway, this is God, but God's name. Whereas in the P source here, in the pink one, it doesn't call God by name, and instead is calling deity by the word God, Elohim in Hebrew. So in other words, this is another distinction and it tracks with these 2 different kinds of sources. What about the sacrifice? So if this P version, as I've been saying, only has 2 of every clean animal, won't Noah accidentally or kill off all of the clean species in order to offer these kind of sacrifices to God, So anyway, the things that you would normally use for an animal sacrifice, those are going to get all killed up. So maybe the unicorns and so forth are the ones that get killed, and that's why we don't have any, huh? But no, because in the P version of Noah's story, there is no sacrifice. So God proclaims a covenant which is sealed with the sign of the rainbow in the P story, but no one, in fact, ever offers a sacrifice in the P story, in the text, prior to Aaron and his descendants in Exodus. And so one of the reasons why we see that, or we think that that's the case is, and this is why we call it the P source, is that the P source is written by someone who considers himself to be a descendant of Aaron, and he is part of a centralizing religious movement that is trying to say that only descendants of Aaron are able to offer sacrifices, and they're only able to do it at the one place, which is at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And so therefore, nobody offers a sacrifice in the P story, previously at all. So Noah doesn't offer a sacrifice, Abraham doesn't try to offer sacrifice, and so on. In the P stories, sacrifices only begin when God commands Aaron to do it, because that's the only time it would be valid. Anyway, so when we take these 2 together, those come together to form a redacted text of the Noah story in Genesis. In other words, we have the J version and the P version. And that results, like I say, in the children's story that we all know and love. So there's one problem today, though, for literalist believers, and that is that there never was a universal flood. So science's picture of the past was still pretty opaque and incomplete in 1830, when Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saint movement, for example, were trying to make literalistic explanations using new scripture in order to explain why there are people and animals in the Americas given a universal flood. Nevertheless, in the 21st century, the sciences, especially geology and paleontology, have concluded that there could not have been a universal flood. So the idea is incompatible with the geological and the fossil record, which is ever more well known. So the flood wasn't universal. Nevertheless, flood myths nearly are. So we've told this story, actually, like we said, 2 interrelated stories that have been spliced together that are from Judea, but there were flood stories across the ancient world, from Mesoamerica to ancient Greece, to Mesopotamia, Akkad and Sumer, to India and China. The flood stories exist also in European mythologies. There's a flood in Finnish mythology, Irish, Welsh, and even Norse mythology. There's flood myths in traditional African societies. The Maasai, Mabudi, Kawaya, Yoruba, Mandan, And there's flood stories in East Asia, Oceania, from the Maoris to Hawaii, the Philippines, Malaysia, the Andamans, Kadai peoples, and also Korea. And there are flood stories across the Americas. Everybody from the Eskimos and the Inuits, the Comac, Samish, Saanich, Anishinaabe, Hopi, Muisca, Tupi, Canary, Inca, and Mapuche peoples. I'm probably now not pronouncing all these right, but anyway, there's flood stories in all of these different places. Okay, let's look at a couple of these. So one of these ancient ones from the Mesoamerica is the Mayan flood myth. So according to the Mayan epic, the Popol Vuh, which is one of the only Mayan books that we have, the codices that were actually not destroyed by the Spanish colonists and instead was preserved, fortunately. Anyway, it's now been totally deciphered and the Mayan language can be read. So according to that epic, 2 eras of creation preceded the present creation of humankind that we're all still experiencing. The second created era, in the second created era, the gods made people out of wood. However, because the wooden people could not speak, they were not able to properly worship their creators, and thus, according to the text, quote, they were killed in the flood. So they wiped them away and they started over again. There's a flood myth from India, the 9th to 10th century. The common era is this representation here. You can see with the fish, giant fish and so on, from the Vedas though. So the Vedas were probably composed in the 6th century BCE and their current written form from the 300s. This is a very early version of an Indian flood story. So in this tale, King Manu encounters a small fish named Matsya who fears being eaten by a larger fish. King Manu lets Matsya live and grow up in a pot of water and then in his pond. And then when this flood came, this universal flood, Matsya, now a giant fish, takes Manu by boat to the Himalayas, which are so tall, obviously, that they're not covered by the waters, and he's thus preserved. There is a flood myth from ancient Greek mythology. According to Hesiod, the 7th century BCE, one of the Titans, Prometheus, molded men out of water and clay and then gave them fire, precisely contrary to the wishes of Zeus, the king of the gods, who then punished the Titan by chaining him to a mountain and having his eagle, who was the symbol of Zeus, to eat out his liver every day, only to have it regrow since he's a god. To punish men, Zeus has Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, create Pandora, the first woman. Big punishment here for the men. And Pandora here comes with a box which is not to be opened. She opens it, releasing all of the world's evils. Prometheus has a son named Deucalion who marries Pandora's daughter Pyrrha. Zeus decides to destroy all of the men of the Bronze Age with a flood. This is, by the way, not the real Bronze Age. This is the mythical Greek Bronze Age. With a flood, Prometheus warns his son, who builds a floating chest. And so after floating for days, the chest lands on Mount Parnassus, again up on top of a tall mountain because the whole earth is covered with water. And Deucalion and Pyrrha are instructed to throw rocks over the shoulders, which become new men and women of the new human race. So they're not all descendants of these two, but 2 alone were saved, and they were given the kind of magical ability to repopulate the earth after a flood. There's floods, like I said, in Mesopotamia. So the earliest surviving flood stories come from ancient Sumer. So one, the Sumerian Genesis, which is surviving in an inscription form from 1600 BCE, but composed much, much earlier. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, fragments of which survive from as early as 2100 BC. So loads earlier than when the biblical story was composed. Thousands of years. So the gods decide that humanity is to be destroyed by a flood, but Ea, or Enki, warns the story's hero to build an ark to survive, saving the world's animals and plants. So I mentioned here that this is kind of just a timeline that is relating to both the Old Testament, but also the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can see here it's kind of going from 4000 BCE to the 1 BCE. And you can see at the very left, if there had been a historic Gilgamesh, it's like from somewhere from 2800 to 2500. The Epic of Gilgamesh is maybe composed at 2100. And then you can see Homer and Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, in other words, the Bible, so much later, thousand more years later, in a much kind of a later time period, obviously, than what has happened back with the Sumerian city-states, some of the earliest of all of the civilizations. All right, let's look a little bit about the Gilgamesh story, since it has priority as the oldest. In the Sumerian Genesis, the surviving hero is Ziusudra, who is the ruler of Shuruppak. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor of the flood is Utnapishtim, who is given immortality and lives in the east in kind of a paradise land of Dilmun. So Gilgamesh, the hero of the epic, when his friend Enkidu is killed, he becomes aware of his own mortality and decides to travel to Dilmun to learn the secret of eternal life. So until his friend dies, Gilgamesh was like any other young guy. He just figures he's going to live forever and he's strong and so on. But now his friend is dead and he's now really struck, wait a second, I'm going to die. And so he goes on this quest to knowing that Utnapishtim has been granted eternal life. Maybe Gilgamesh can find out that secret. On this quest, Gilgamesh in his bitterness cries, "How can I rest? How can I be at peace? Despair is in my heart. What my brother is now," his friend Enkidu, "that I shall be when I'm dead. Because I am afraid of death, I will go as best I can to find Utnapishtim, whom they call the Faraway, for he has entered the assembly of the gods." And so this is a map here of the Babylonian map, anyway, of the Babylonian worldview, which may be derived ultimately from how the Sumerians, who really influenced the Babylonians, what they essentially thought of how the world worked. And so Gilgamesh travels beyond the ocean, the gardens of the sun, beyond the edges of the mortal world to Dilmun, which is kind of like Eden, although obviously much earlier in terms of ideas. So he encounters Siduri, the goddess of wine, and Siduri advises him, "Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things day and night and day. Dance and be merry. Feast and rejoice, let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water, cherish the little child that holds your hand, make your wife happy in your embrace, for this too is the lot of man." So this is very, very early response to the complaint of mortality. If you are going to die anyway, eat, drink, and be merry, and or also, think about community, think about your family, your child, your wife, and so on. Countering Utnapishtim. So he goes on, does not listen to her. He completely wasted by his journey. And Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim the Faraway, the survivor of the flood, to whom the gods have given eternal life. Gilgamesh explains why he's made his quest, and he says, "I wish to question you concerning the living and the dead. How shall I find the life for which I am searching?" Utnapishtim doesn't have a happier response for him than anybody else on this quest. He says, "There is no permanence. Do we build a house to stand forever? Do we seal a contract to hold for all time? The sleeping and the dead, how alike they are. They are like a painted death. What is the difference between the master and the servant when both have fulfilled their doom? It doesn't matter how rich you are, you're going to die like everybody else. It doesn't matter that you're the greatest hero that ever was, Gilgamesh. This is what it is to be immortal." When the Anunnaki, the judges, come together, and Memetun, the mother of destinies, together they decree the fates of men. Life and death they allot, but the day of death they do not disclose. So Utnapishtim explains that his own immortality was a gift from all of the gods after he survived the Great Flood, a universal calamity. He then tells the story of the flood, which is another epic that is embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that story is strikingly similar to the story in Genesis. So Utnapishtim concludes by asking, who's going to assemble the gods for your sake, Gilgamesh? This was a one-time gift that Utnapishtim has received, and it's not going to be repeated. To prove his point, Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to just conquer sleep, much less death. So sleep is so much like death. Conquer sleep for 6 days and 7 nights, which the hero fails to do. So he tries to stay up and he finds himself dozing and ultimately he falls asleep. Nevertheless, as a consolation, Utnapishtim reveals a divine secret of a plant under the sea that will at least restore lost youth. And so Gilgamesh goes under the sea to harvest that. And when he brings the plant back, he says, I will take this to Uruk. There I will give it to the old men to eat. And last I shall eat and have back my lost youth. So as he's returning with the flower that restores youth, Gilgamesh takes the opportunity to rest and bathe by a pool. But while he does it, a serpent rises out of the water and snatches it away. Which is why, this is how we can tell, in other words, this is how myths work. This is why serpents can renew their youth by shedding their skin. So if you've ever seen how snakes operate and as they grow, so every once in a while they get to a size that they shed all of their own skin and it looks like they are made new again. And the snakes have this power according to the Gilgamesh myth because they snatched away this flower that Gilgamesh then loses and is not able to be had for humans. So humans can't renew their youth the way that snakes can. Gilgamesh laments, was it for this that I have wrung out my heart's blood? For myself I've gained nothing. All right, so it's a very sophisticated myth. We've had a lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh before, but I really like it. So one of the arguments, so we've said scientifically there was no universal myth, but then people argue, okay, maybe I don't, it doesn't add up somehow for me, though, that if there's myths like this all across the world, doesn't that mean that people have some kind of shared memory of something that was a universal myth and so forth? Doesn't the ubiquity of the myth argue for a flood? People also, as is their wont, are desperate to find a fabled kernel of truth behind the myth. And so one of the most famous and very certainly neat and intriguing hypotheses is that some 7,000 years ago, so maybe 5,000 BCE, there had been a huge a break that in the water as a water poured into what became the Black Sea, and so in other words that it had been an open undersea, lower than sea level area which suddenly broke where seawater broke through and filled it up very rapidly, causing a very substantial. I mean, if you think of the Black Sea, that's an area just north of Turkey. It's actually right in the middle of all of this current. There's Crimea right there, right? Going on with Ukraine and Russia and so forth right now. So that this filled up, and obviously, even though this is not a universal flood, it's certainly a very big flood, and there might have been, if this had been the case, there might have been all kinds of human villages and so forth that had been existing, and suddenly they were all wiped out. All right, so before we continue with that and think about that, I want to tell a flood myth from my own family story. So, the Hamer family. The ancient homeland of my paternal ancestors, if you go back on the paternal line, into the early 1700s, is New Jersey. So a very historic land indeed. And so this here on the left is a picture of a store in Trenton, New Jersey in 1879 that are owned by my great-great-grandparents, Abram and Anna Hamer. The little boy in the foreground is my great-grandfather, Charles Hamer, and he's standing next to his sister, Elizabeth, with their mother, Anna. This is also from my ancestors, so on my father's mother's side, her father, Oliver Soule, this is his Model T Ford car dealership in Trenton, New Jersey in 1918, as they were a very early Ford dealer. This is Grandpa Soule, the same guy here who had the garage. This is him when I knew him when I was 3 years old in 1973, and he gave me a truck. And so there is overlap here between Grandpa Sol and so forth and that. So like I say, this flood myth is set in my ancestral homeland of New Jersey. My great-grandparents, Oliver and Matilda Sol, here they are on the Jersey Shore, which is what people in Jersey do during the summertime. It's a little different in 1934 than it is in the reality TV shows these days. Here's my own grandfather, Bill Hamer, and his sister Lorna, my great-aunt, wearing their amazing 1932 beachwear. Anyway, okay, enough of that. But why I tell that as a background is that this is Oliver and Matilda Sol's house in Trenton during the 1936 flood when Trenton was flooded. And everybody here is wandering around in boats because the whole city is flooded. Here is my grandmother, Hamer, Gloria Sol, here in the center in the boat, boating to her house in Trenton during the 1936 flood. So Grandma Hamer. So here's me with Grandma Hamer, who died about 10 years ago, so before her death. So despite the considerable generational overlap, and despite the fact that we know there was a flood, and there's a Hamer flood story, no flood story at all was passed on in the oral tradition. Grandpa Sol never told me about a flood. Grandma Hamer never told me about a flood. I'm personally aware of that flood because I've seen all these photos of my grandmother boating around in front of their house and so forth. So it is very unlikely that anybody in the next generation of Hamers has even seen this amount of awareness. They haven't seen these old pictures and so on, and so they haven't also talked to any of these grandparents who were all dead before they were born. So, for the Black Sea story here, we are requiring some 4,000 years of oral tradition. So, although my family's 3 generations failed to remember a flood, that's not compared to oral transmission of antiquity. There is no evidence that stories like Noah's Ark are built on thousands and thousands of years of oral tradition where some really impressive flood happened, no doubt if that did happen. And maybe for the first little while, people would remember that as a pretty big deal. There is no cause to remember, or no cause to speculate or do you think for a second that influenced people who remembered that and told that. That's not how the story is told at all in any of these kinds of floods. And none, for example, in terms of the biblical story, none of the earliest prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, none of them mention Noah. By contrast, all of them know and reference David. Isaiah speaks about Moses. In other words, these stories, the story of David, the story of Moses, and so on, those were already known and part of the culture when the earliest prophets exist and were writing, whereas the stories like Noah and the Ark are written later, probably, because we have no evidence that they're known by the earliest prophets. So where do these stories come from? If it's not because there's actually some remembrance of a really big flood. So ancient people had no developed science of paleontology. They nevertheless frequently encountered fossils. So for example, in ancient Greece and Rome, people regularly found and remarked upon and displayed the bones of giants. In the 1st century BC, the Emperor Augustus had a museum of giant bones built on the island of Capri. So they would find in these fossils, marine fossils on top of mountains. So as attested in ancient historical sources, people frequently found the fossils of fish and so forth on mountains, leading to them the question, how could fish get up there? So rather than preserving thousands of years of unattested oral tradition, flood myths are most likely to be, or more likely to be, ideological, which is to say, how do you explain these fish, how these stone fish or whatever fish fossils got on top of a mountain? The answer is whatever, there had been a universal flood at some time that brought them all up there, according to this myth. In other words, an ideological myth that provides an explanation for a phenomenon that can't otherwise or wasn't otherwise able to be understood at the time. So, finding truth in myths. So while there is more truth to be found in flood stories than looking for kernels, there that is not the place to look for that truth. In other words, the place to find that truth is not to look at historicity. So looking at the ideas, for example, that whole long component of the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh that I read, we see from that story that as long ago as 4,000 years, humans were struggling with the ideas of mortality and death, of suffering, of finding meaning in life, and asking themselves, what constitutes a life well lived? And so, in my view, that's where we should be looking for truth in these stories. We shouldn't be trying to say, well, there must have been some kernel of truth, there must have been some remembered flood, and looking all around to see things like I say, the Black Sea. Yeah, of course there are floods, and that's one of the reasons why people tell stories where there are floods as a damage. But that's the historicity of these stories is not where their value lies. All right. Well, so as always, I'm going to now interact with your questions that you have been leaving in the discussions. And while Leandro is providing those for me and then sending those to me, I want to read and leave you with some discussion questions that you can be thinking about. So our first question is Noah and the Ark a suitable story for children? And if it is, if you agree that it is, what is the moral that you think ought to be taught when we're telling this story to children? Number 2, when a sacred story comes down to us in a version that is clearly mythical, so for example, no matter what, we know there is no universal flood where everything was wiped out, what are the costs or benefits of insisting that there must have been some kind of historical truth? So if, in other words, if you want to retell this story by saying, oh, well, there really was a Noah, but there's just a little tiny flood that existed somewhere in, Mesopotamia or something like that, and all this happened, but it wasn't, I don't know. In other words, what are the costs and benefits of insisting that there must be some kind of a historical kernel or truth as opposed to simply reading the story and reading it as sacred story that is not history? And 3, can you think of any examples, and maybe share some of these, of modern myths, something that clearly started as a myth that has then become historicized so that people go back and believe now that actually happened? All right. And so I'm going to have a glass of water, and then maybe we'll get to, if some of you left some questions, I'll be able to interact with you. Thanks. Okay, Roan Wagner asks, was the Noah story created after the Jews were captured and taken to Babylon? So, dating the Torah, dating the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and especially in this case what we're talking about is Genesis, is a little bit complicated, and different scholars think different things, and so. Definitely what we can say is the Genesis as we have it now, or the Noah story as we have it now, was composed after, or compiled together or edited together after even they've come back from Babylon. So not only when they were in Babylon, after they've come back. But in terms of this, if the documentary hypothesis is correct, and there's a J story and a P story, some people, myself included, maybe argue that the J story exists. Existed then, or was composed before the fall of Jerusalem. We don't know that, but anyway, if it was, it's still it would still be a later addition to First Temple Jewish religion than some of the earlier prophets, which is why, again, those earliest prophets, Isaiah and so forth, don't talk about it and don't know it. I mean, that's a negative evidence, but we don't see that story as known until later. So if it did exist, if the J writer is writing such a story before the Babylonians conquer them, it's not like there's not substantial Babylonian or not Babylonian, but Mesopotamian influence. So that story is very famous. It could have still made it into Jerusalem without everybody being conquered. Okay, Daryl Scott asks, when people do teach Noah's Ark to children, what moral or theology do the teachers think they're teaching? Well, that was my first question. So Daryl, you've asked the same question that I'm asking. I think that what they're doing is they've got a story, and there's animals, and kids like animals, and there's a rainbow, and it's, and so I don't know. Maybe I think that maybe a story that people think they're teaching is that if you're righteous and good, God is going to save you. But if so, that's heresy from a traditional Christian standpoint, which is to say, it's not, God's grace is not conditional like that. And so I don't know what they're thinking they're teaching. That's why I'm asking. And I was actually saying, why are we teaching this, or why is this a kid's story? So anyway, we would have to ask somebody who's actually teaching it what they think. I've been a little dubious of showing that to kids. Okay, Michael Gerard says, does Jesus' mention of Noah add any credence to the flood story? So although I'm saying that that the fact that the earliest prophets don't mention the flood story is an evidence that it wasn't known or hadn't been created yet by the time that they were writing. One of the reasons why I think that's negative evidence. So when we say, oh well, that's omitted, it's not as strong as positive evidence where you actually have something being said and we know that this is the origin or something like that. I'm saying that since it's not present there, we might assume that it hasn't been written yet, but there's no proof that it isn't written because it's negative evidence. Nevertheless, the fact that Jesus is mentioning it shows how important, in fact, the Noah story becomes later. And so again, because of how important the Noah story is after it's composed, that adds to the my argument that the fact that it wasn't mentioned earlier is actually stronger evidence, even though it's negative evidence, right? So does Jesus' mention of the Noah story add any credence to it as though it was a literal story, is what this is? And I would say no, because the historical Jesus, so one, we don't know, we have to track down whether, let's say, the historical Jesus said any of the particular things in any of the accounts that we have, and how credible we think him saying any of those things were. And then two, as we've talked about before, in terms of the difference between, the historical Jesus and the Jesus of Scripture and the Christ of theology. The historical Jesus was living in the context that he's in. Second Temple Jewish people would have assumed that the flood had been a real event, and so then he would be wrong. So it doesn't mean that it's more likely to be true. Next, Fastball Flakes is wanting to talk about that discussion question number 3. And so that was the question where I asked, what's something that began as a myth that people later historicized and started believing had exactly existed? And so he says, Slender Man, originally created for a web forum Photoshop contest. It's a good study in modern folklore and its spread in the evolution of the story mythos at internet hyperspeed. So that sounds very interesting. I'm not aware of that phenomenon, and so I'll have to go look up Slender Man and hear how that all went. So it's very interesting. Thank you. Mark B. asks, how does the story of Atlantis fit into the flood stories? So the story of Atlantis is interesting because, unlike a lot of myths, we can't tell when the myth was actually created. So like I was saying, with the Noah story, we don't really know how the J author is probably the earliest author. So how does the J author come by that story? Is it a brand new composition of the Yahweh, the J author? Is it something that had been kind of in the oral tradition that Jewish people of the first temple had gotten from their neighbors, who'd gotten it from so on and so on, all the way back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim and stuff like that? Is that where it comes from? We can't really say. With the Atlantis myth, which is absolutely a myth. We know who made it up, and we know where it started, which is it was created by Plato. So one of the very important early philosophers in ancient Greece. He made it up as a thought experiment. There was no historical Atlantis. There has not. All searches for, quests for the historical Atlantis. Every time anybody wants to go to Thera at a volcano and say this is where Atlantis was and it blew up, that's absolutely wrong, because Plato made it up as a thought experiment story, and his student Aristotle said, Plato made it up. We know where that comes from. So I know people love Atlantis and they would like to have a historical Atlantis. We know that there isn't one. So it's not related to the flood stories. Chris Gomez. Why do you think the preemptive measure of building an ark was documented rather than created? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm sorry, Chris. So documented rather than created. It's part of the story. So one of the things in terms of having an ark.
Why did people write about it? What's the point of the story?
What's the point of the story? Why did people write about it? So the idea of it here is that this is people telling a story of. There's multiple versions of the story, so we'll go ahead and use the Genesis story because it's more familiar to people. God is destroying all of humanity and actually all creatures on the earth. In other words, there's a universal Holocaust that's coming. But simultaneously, God has one favorite on the planet that he decides to save. And so the preemptive measure of building of an ark here is God giving the way out for that guy. And so, I don't know, it makes it somewhat more, let's say, realistic seeming or whatever than if it's just that God takes him like he takes Enoch or Elijah or something like that and then could put him back, you'd think, afterwards. I mean, I think in the way it's more... there's less magic involved than in the Greek story where the gods save the people in a box, and when they come out they get to throw stones over their backs and that creates new people, right? That becomes a little less historical seeming, right? But anyway, it's just part of how the story unfolds in order to show God's interaction with his prophet. Dionysius Infinitum says, shouldn't we be teaching that the earth itself is an ark and it should be preserved, and that the mythical Noah was the first environmentalist? Well, I think that would be a wonderful story to teach with the to take this ancient story and purpose it to our needs today, right? So as never before, obviously, the earth is incredibly smaller in a practical sense than it had ever been back when these flood stories were first told. So we are now in a place where you can travel all around the world. It's all known. You can go home or you're home right now. You can look around on Google Earth and zoom in on satellite to any part of it. In other words, it's all completely known, and you can travel to it and so forth. But we can also, because there's so many of us and we're in the middle of doing all things, we can also cause total and irreparable damage to this. We're actually all stuck on this together, this ark, and in fact, there's not another one, so anybody who thinks that it's going to be easy to get on a lifeboat to Moon or Mars, that is not. It's a lot easier to live in Antarctica than it is to live in those places, and it's not particularly easy to live in Antarctica, as we know. So anyway, yes, we should maybe be thinking of that. So Ron Wagner has some ideas for the the three questions. And so for the first one, which was, should we tell this to children? If so, what's the moral? And he says, I do think it's okay to tell children. And the moral he would like to say is, follow God's direction wherever it takes you. So I think that's a good story. So, have faith. We don't know what this ark is going to be necessarily even for. God tells you to build a boat in the middle of the desert and so on. But it ends up having a good end in that way. Number 2 what's the question for number 2? Can I see if we can? Okay. The number 2 was, what are the cost and benefits of insisting that a sacred story that's clearly myth actually has a kernel of truth? And so he says one of the consequences of it, and a detraction of it, is that it could really lead to a false sense of history. And I completely agree with you, Ron. I also think it also completely distorts the story. So in other words, whatever the meaning of the story was, the story in the case of the Noah story it's about universal Holocaust. It's not some little thing that happens somewhere or whatever. So I think to warp the story around to try to make it literally historic misses the whole point of the story. And then Ron has the example of, in question number 3, of a myth that has been historicized of Washington chopping down the cherry tree. That's a very famous one where George Washington's kind of popular biographer told a story of Washington chops down a cherry tree, and then he goes and tells his dad that he did it, admits he did it, he shows that, he says, "I cannot tell a lie," and so that's showing his character from an early childhood, that even though he's a little rascal like all young boys who uses a hatchet to chop down trees and so forth that shouldn't be, he nevertheless has such integrity that he's going to always be honest forever, and that's what he's showing. And then kind of famously, that story has been debunked, and so that's like you say. So even though that story is there and people assumed it was history, it's kind of maybe the most famous story of a story that doesn't have any basis. But nevertheless, it's that particular example is one of those cases where we can't say it for sure. So there's a bunch of debunkings where we can say, okay, there's the Noah story, there is no historical basis for that at all. With this, the cherry tree story is actually a little more nuanced, and so we just have negative evidence. In other words, we don't have the story. The story isn't told in anywhere we can find it before this biography, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have some source that was possible. Anyway, now I'm not saying the cherry tree story happened, but what I'm saying is that we can't as easily say it absolutely didn't happen. All right, next, Stephanie. So Stephanie is saying, in terms of the questions. The Noah and the Ark story, first question, that's not a story for children. She says, you might as well tell them if their art doesn't turn out as planned to throw a tantrum and rip it up to shreds. So God here is not being a good example for kids to follow in terms of him. The God of the Old Testament sometimes does things that seem, very, I'd say, bizarre and not very particularly good, and like you say, maybe infantile here as he's throwing a tantrum, and the tantrum results in a global Holocaust. 2, in terms of Stephanie's question here for the second one about the costs of trying to insist that there's a kernel of a truth in a story that's really myth, she says that the cost here is to your own credibility and also your moral. We don't take spiritual lessons from history books. So yeah, so again, people have spent the last couple hundred years especially really emphasizing and valuing historicity. When people talk about stories and it's like a story that didn't happen or something like that, people say, well, that's not true. Or they'll talk about or they'll ask, when somebody tells a story that happened to them, is that true? As if truth is history. But Stephanie here is right to tell us here, we don't draw spiritual lessons from history books. You can learn from history in different kinds of ways, but the authors of these stories, the Genesis story and things like that, those are written before the invention of history as a discipline at all. It's not meant to be a history book. It is, however, meant to talk about the human condition. And certainly, like I say, when we read that story from the Epic of Gilgamesh, that still resonates, and that's been thousands and thousands of years. And then Stephanie just says, in terms of myths that have been historicized. She just says American history. So that's kind of a blanket condemnation of how people understand American history. And there's something to be said for that. I mean, of course, that's true for everybody's history. You know, we as societies all tell stories, identity stories of how we want to understand ourselves to be. And unfortunately, that tends to paper over all the things that we don't want to, understand about ourselves, and so that's true at all the time. So, Mike Rogers says, "Isn't the Book of Mormon the attempted historization of an American creation myth? Does that mean that 3rd Nephi 11 didn't occur in fact?" So, Mike, my view is, and that we can say we can say very clearly from an academic perspective, from a historical, archaeological, and literary critical analysis of the Book of Mormon, it is absolutely written in the 19th century, and it does not refer to historical events that occurred before that time. So in fact, the events in 3rd Nephi, and in fact, everything in the Book of Mormon did not occur in history. It's like the story of the prodigal son, or something like that. In other words, or the beautiful stories like the Book of Ruth, Daniel. These are stories that Noah and the Ark. These are stories that are not histories. That's right. They're stories that don't have. They're literary and only. Next, we have to scroll. All right. Michael Gerard says, do indigenous peoples of the United States have flood stories? Yes. So I didn't have, when we did that whole map, I don't remember which all the ones they were, but I, kind of at the middle of the lecture, I was showing how kind of flood stories are ubiquitous, and those are true all the way across the Americas, and several of those peoples, I think, are I remember, for example, Eskimo was one of the ones that were on the list, but anyway, there were other ones too that are from the United States as opposed to Canada. So there's First Nations people in Canada that have flood stories, and same thing, indigenous peoples of the US too, yes. Bob Garrison asks, do young Earth creationists take this story literally? Yes, they do. And so young Earth creationists are people who believe that the planet is only 6,000 years old or something like that. And so they, as a result, deny all scientific reality and instead make a kind of a counter-science, a pseudoscience of their own, and the flood is massively important for their pseudoscience. And so all kinds of crazy things, like the reason why there are those fossils up on top of mountains and things like that, that's because of the flood, which was very literal for young Earth creationists. There is no scientific basis for any of it. It's completely impossible. It's a counter-reality worldview. Try Too Hard for Fun asks, how would you answer a mystical reading of the Great Flood? That the flood waters is a symbol of God's cleansing the earth of evil and wickedness, not that there was an actual physical flood. Yeah, so I think that would be fine and great. And in fact, there's, in terms of that, I mean, there's been modern Christian and Christian interpretations where, I mean, it might have even been the New Testament, that where the flood is seen symbolically as a baptism of the earth, right? And so, in which case, it's a symbolic one, right? Where the same thing symbolically in baptism, the old person dies and then comes out of the water reborn anew, right? And so, in the same way, the old carnal world is cleansed and begins a new life anew. But in not something that actually happened. It's symbolic. I mean, baptisms happen, but you're not really dying, right? So it would be symbolic in that same sense. So I think that's definitely a good way to read it. Maybe also considering it didn't happen in terms of a historical, literal history. Wanda Mercer asks, with all these universal myths, What sense are we to make out of them theologically important for us in our day and age? Well, Wanda, there have been there have been a bunch of different options that people have even given already in the comments, so I think some of which are good. The one we just barely talked about, this idea of death, rebirth, and renewal, and so on. And so I think that there are different ways that we can kind of read these. And one of the other proposals was that has given earlier in the comments was, should we take this as a reminder of the sacredness of creation and how we're stewards of the planet, and that we should be treating that accordingly, and that we can cause horrible destruction in our own limited time that we exist on the earth, and then there's all the people after us that have to deal with all of the waste and problems that we've created in our time, and so forth. And so I think that we can still derive value from these, but we just have to rethink them, think of them like has been suggested, mythically, symbolically, mystically, and so forth. Chris Gomez says, could you speak more on the universal Holocaust? Does the concept inherently require the agency of a higher power in the flood story? I'm not sure where I see regular people being participants. So the being that's committing the universal Holocaust is God or the gods, depending on if it's a polytheist story. And so it's not something like a Holocaust, like when we talk about the Holocaust. When we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about World War II and the Nazis and killing all of the Jews and everyone else that the Nazis killed. I was using this as like not in that particular form, but just in general, when you were just killing off everybody. You would say a genocide or something like that. You could also call it, but it's just bigger than a genocide because it's killing everybody and everything on the planet. And so that's what I meant by using that word, universal Holocaust. Specifically, everything and everybody is wiped off the planet. Both in the Noah story and in the Gilgamesh story, and so on. So, all right. Well, folks, this has been a fun one. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really appreciated your comments and the discussion. I'll remind you, I don't know if we can have slides back and go back to those, or are we going to have one more comment?
Just one.
Oh, there's one more comment. Never mind. Here's a good question. Leander tells me. Nope.
They're all good.
Okay, here we go. Michelangelo says, I have a question. What do you think of Levi Strauss's ideas about universal myths or Jung collective unconsciousness as explanations for the universality of these myths? So I'm not opposed to those kinds of ideas. So I think that there is something to be said for the idea of universal myths and also a collective unconsciousness. I'm not as particularly committed to the very particulars of those two schools of thought, but the idea that there are, let's say, commonly held archetypes that transcend individual cultures, I think is perfectly plausible. We find very common things and themes, but they're not. So in terms of calling them universal myths or the universality of them, in terms of the collective unconscious, I would say they tend to not be totally universal because there's almost always a countertype to the archetype, and so there are almost always you can find almost everybody's has this kind of a story, but then these guys over here have a different take, and so almost everybody sees this way, but other people, there are some cultures that see things kind of differently. So I guess I would say is that there's some of these broad ideas, and they are valuable to explore. I enjoy talking, and am very interested in exploring kinds of archetypes and those kind of things. But for me, I think the important thing is to detach them from a sense or a theory that you might have that there's historicity behind them. It's not that there is a collective memory of some historical event that is being passed along through unintentional oral tradition or something like that, unconsciously or something like that. I don't think that that's the case. In other words, there may be themes that are things like Gilgamesh was worrying about, which is to say suffering, mortality, all those things like that. Those are themes that exist maybe more universally, but those don't go back to one historical moment when the first guy realized that he's going to die, or the first woman. The reality is people were dying before they understood, before they really consciously understood anything like that, since we go back to much more primitive or beings that have much less sophisticated thinking capacity. So that's what I would say. Richard Goodman, responding to question number 2 in terms of the cost and benefit of insisting that there's a kernel of truth behind myths, he says, benefits I'm thinking of the Loch Ness Monster, that mysteries in existence have a tangible parallel in reality that our imagination can bridge. So, yeah. I'm just trying to think about this. So I'm not against being imaginative, and I actually do think, I don't know, wanting to have mystery and enchantment in our life is, I think, and being imaginative about that, I think a positive desire. I don't think that we should have I don't know, a world that is totally deflated of enchantment and where everything is very, I don't know, cold ice bucket poured over top of everybody at all times because nothing fun exists and so on. So I agree with you on that point. I don't know, though, that too much time should be spent in extreme, let's say, extreme ideas of making pseudoscientific explanations of the Loch Ness Monster existing or Bigfoot or something like that and getting really into that, because it can take you down a kind of I don't know, a kind of a crazy conspiracy theory alternate reality. So it would just be a matter of balancing that and keeping the fun as opposed to getting into kind of a twisted counter reality. Okay, so now we're going to conclude. Thank you all so much. Wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it, and we will have a lecture on Christian militancy on Thursday, and we'll see you next week for the book of Jasher. I don't have slides.